Hi, my name is Margaret. Welcome to Knit Pickers in beautiful Prince Edward Island. Today we're going to take a look at some different techniques in terms of increasing your stitches. We're going to look at yarn overs, make one, which could be make one left or make one right. We'll also look at the lifted stitch increases, lifted left leaning and lifted right leaning. And finally, we're going to look at the knit one front and back. So there's all sorts of different ways to increase your stitches in knitting, and they all have different applications, but nothing is hard to do. So, shall we get started? So here's a little sampler piece I did showing the different increased stitch techniques. Down here at the bottom, right here, those increases were done with yarn overs. And here, those stitches were done with what is commonly referred to as just make one or M1. In this section here, the stitches were increased by using the technique of knitting front and back, and that's often referred to as KFB. When you are doing that type of increase, it does leave a little purl bump. You can see that right here in the stitch. It's not really visible, but there it is again, a little purl bump. So this type of an increase I would tend to use if I was doing perhaps an increase in ribbing or an increase in, say, a basket weave knit. What you do want to keep in mind is when you are doing your increase on the stockinette side, on the knit side, when the piece is facing you, the knit bump, the little purl bump here, is going to appear to the left of the stitch that you're working the increase. So if you're knitting a basket weave stitch, for example, you'll want that little purl bump to fit in with your other purl stitches. Down here, these applications, the yarn overs and the standard make one, those I would use if I wanted to really highlight the increase in some way, perhaps creating a lacy top with a raglan sleeve, or specifically when I was knitting a lace project. Other than that, I don't tend to use this type of increase terribly much. In this section, we did a lifted left increase and a lifted right increase. And I'll show you those as well. Those are really quite interesting because they tend to almost disappear. Of course, you see the increase, but it's not visible like with the little bumps here or the holes that are created here. And finally, up at the very top, you have make one right and make one left. There isn't a huge difference between the lifted increases and the make one right and make one left increases, but these ones perhaps show up a little more in your design. So if you want to give a slight highlight to your increases, that's the stitch that you'll want to do. And all in all, I tend to find they look maybe just a little bit tidier than your lifted increases as well. So this stitch, the make one right and the make one left, as a personal preference, that tends to be my go-to increase. And when I want to just do a single increase, say for instance you're knitting a sweater and you finished your ribbing and you want to go and increase all the way across. Maybe you're increasing 10 stitches over the whole body of the sweater. I would then just tend to do the make one right leaning. So what I've got now is a little swatch where I've got all of the stitches in a row. And I'm going to take you step by step through each one. We'll do them twice, and that way you can get a little bit of a sense of how this is going to look in a finished work. So what I did on my sampler here is I knit a few rows of garter, and then I knit 2 rows of stockinette. I did 1 row knit and 1 row purl, and then I knit 1 row of all of my different increases, yarn overs, make one, knit 1 front and back. I did the left and right leaning, and finally I did the make one left and make one right. So we'll go over that twice, and what you'll see is then you'll have a series of 3 stitches in a column that will give you an idea of how those increases look. So let's get started, shall we? So here we are getting started. I've knit 4 stitches. I'll now knit my 5th stitch, and I'm just going to do a simple yarn over. Now when you're setting up to do increased stitches, you always want to have at least 1 stitch in between your increases, 1 regular knitted stitch. So because I already did 1 row where I did my increases on this particular sampler, I started out with 1 stitch in between my increases, but because I did my increases already on 1 row, I'm now going to be knitting 3 stitches between each increase. So here's my 5 stitches, my yarn over, and then I'll just knit 1, 2, 3 stitches, and I'll do another yarn over, and then I'm going to do 5 more stitches, and then we'll be doing our standard make one. So the standard make one leaves a slightly smaller eyelet than the yarn over does. So to do a standard make one, not make one right or make one left leaning, but a standard make one, all you're doing is you're taking your right hand needle, you're going into this bar. If you stretch it out, you'll see a bar between the stitches. So you're just going to go from the front to the back and pick up your yarn. See what I'm doing there? Going in front to back, pick up the bar and loop that onto your needle, and you've just made a brand new stitch. I'll knit my 3 stitches. And then I'm going to make another stitch again. So I'm just going to go from front to back. I pick up that bar in between, front to back, grab my yarn here and pull it through, and there's my new stitch. And then I'm going to knit 5 more stitches, and that'll bring us to where we're going to do our knit front and back increase. And if this looks a little awkward, it's because it is a little awkward. When I'm doing these demos, I'm trying to knit around a tripod. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult for me to see what I'm doing here. There we go. So now I've knit my 5 stitches, and I'm at a point where I'm going to do an increase by knitting front and back. So what you do with that is you go into your stitch just as if you were going to knit a normal stitch. So in like that, wrap your yarn, bring it through, but rather than taking this stitch off the needle, we're not going to slip it off yet. We swing it around and go it and knit in the back of the stitch. And there we go. So coming out of that stitch, we have 2 stitches. But you can see here we're going to be creating that little purl bump that you see. So once again, I'll knit my 3 stitches in between my increases. And we'll knit front and back. So in like you would do a normal knit stitch, wrap your yarn around, come down, but don't slip it off the left needle. Take your right hand needle, go into the back of the stitch and knit from behind, lift it up. There are the 2 stitches, your original stitch and the stitch you created, and slide that off. And now I'm going to knit 5 more stitches, and that's going to take us to our lifted left increase and our lifted right increase. So let's just see here. That's 4. Here we are, so that's 5. So when you do your lifted left stitch and your lifted right stitch, or right leaning stitch and left leaning stitch, the first one that we're going to do is the right lifted stitch. So you take your right needle and you're going to insert it into the right leg of the stitch below. So you see there's the stitch below right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it and we're going to insert our needle, just sort of picking it up like that, and we're going to pop that onto our left hand needle. And then we're just going to knit it like normal. So that lifted stitch that we did, we're just going to lift it or knit it as if it was a normal stitch. There we go, 1, and then we've got 3 stitches in between. And now what we want to do is we want to do our right leaning increase, or I should say our left leaning increase. So one is leaning that way and the other one is leaning that way. So for our left leaning increase, we actually want to knit the stitch that we're going to increase first. And then with our left hand needle, rather than going down into the stitch directly below, we're going to go down 2 stitches. So here's the stitch that we just finished knitting. Going into the left leg, that would only be 1 stitch below. So we're going to go 2 stitches below and lift up that left leg, just like that. And we're going to knit that stitch. Now I'm just going to knit 4 stitches because that's what I have in between the next set of increases. And we're going to do a make one right and a make one left. So to do your make one right, an easy way to remember it when you're doing it, if you're making a make one right, you're going to take your left hand needle and go through the bar from back to front, just like that. And what that does is that twists your stitch a little bit. And so you're just going to knit that in the front just like normal. And then if I want to do a make one left, I'm knitting my 3 stitches in between. So if you're doing a make one left, you're going to insert your right needle and you're going to take that up from back to front, picking up that bar back to front. Now what I would do, what they normally say is you pop that onto your left needle and then you're going to knit it into the back. And that's all fine and well, but you know what? When you've taken your right needle and you've inserted it from back to front, you've already got your right needle in position to knit into the back of the stitch. So all you do is you take your left needle and insert it into the front of the stitch, and your needles are in the right position to knit. And there you go. I just knit into the back of the stitch and I created a left leaning make one. And now I'm just going to knit to the end of the row here. So on the wrong side, I'm just going to do a purl stitch all the way across, and then I'll come back and we'll do this technique one more time, showing all of the different types of increases. So I'll join you in just a minute. So here I am back again. I just finished doing a purl stitch all the way across. I'm back on my right side. I've knit 4 stitches. So I'll knit my 5th stitch in my pattern sequence. Then I'm going to increase my stitch just by doing a yarn over, which is just wrapping the yarn around your needle. Now, because I've done the increases twice now, in between each increase, I'm now going to have 5 stitches. So I started out with 1 stitch in between each increase, and then I did my series of paired increases, which gave me 2 additional increases. So the next time I was doing an increase row, I was knitting 3 stitches in between. Now I'm on another row and I've done another set of paired increases. So now I have 5 stitches in between each one. So here's my yarn over. Now I'm going to knit 5 stitches. And then we'll do our next yarn over. And as I said, when you're doing knit increases, the yarn overs are lovely in a lace design, or if you really, really want to have an open work increase. But other than that, I don't tend to use yarn overs all that much. So now, in between my styles of increases, I set this up so that I had 5 stitches in between. And so next up will be our regular make one. Not make one left leaning or make one right leaning, just a regular make one stitch. And again, that is going to create a little bit of a lacy pattern for you. So it gives you a smaller eyelet than the yarn overs do. So to do that make one, I take my right hand needle and I pick up the bar between the stitches right here. From front to back, I wrap my yarn around and bring it through, and there's the stitch I just made. So I'll do 5 stitches in between, and then we'll do one more make one. So here we are with the right hand needle, picking up the bar from front to back, wrapping your yarn and bringing that stitch through the bar and onto your needle. There, you've just made your stitch. And I'm going to knit 5 more stitches before we get to our next type of increase. So to do the next increase, that is going to be our knit front and back. So what you do is you go into your stitch just as if you were going to knit it, a regular old knit stitch. Bring it through, but don't slide it off your left hand needle. Take your right hand needle and knit into the back of that stitch. There we go. Knit 5 stitches in between. And then we're going to do a knit front and back again. So in like a regular knit stitch, wrap your yarn, knit it through, but don't slide it off your left needle. Go into the back, knit through the back of that stitch as well. And then we're going to knit 5. And we're going to do our left lifted increase and our right lifted increase. So for the left lifted increase, what you do is you pick up with your right hand needle, you pick up the leg of the stitch below. Now someone explained this in an interesting way. If you think of the stitch that you're going to create as your baby stitch, you want to first work with your mother, and the mother is 1 generation below. So you're picking up the left or the right hand bar with your right hand needle. You're picking up the right hand bar of the stitch below, so the mother stitch. You pop that onto your left hand needle and you knit through. And then I'll knit my 5 stitches in between. And when you get to your left lifted or left lifted increase, you are actually going to knit the stitch that you want to do your increase on. And instead of doing the mother, you're now doing the grandmother. So there's the baby. The row right below is the mother. The row right below that is the grandmother. So you've knit your stitch. There's the right leg of the first row below. So with your left hand needle, you're picking up the right leg, but not the first row below. You're going 1 more down. And you're picking that one up. And then you're going to knit that through. And that is your right lifted increase and your left lifted increase. And then I'm just going to knit 4 stitches in between. And now we're going to do our make 1 right and our make 1 left. So when you do the make 1 right, you insert your left needle from back to front, and you can see that gives a little bit of a twist to that stitch, and that's good because that means you're not going to have a hole. You knit through that twisted bar. I knit my 5 stitches. And then to do my left leaning increase, I'm going to take my right needle and go from back to front. There we go. And rather than having to pop it onto my left needle, I'm already in position to knit into the back of the stitch. So I just insert my left needle into the front of the stitch like that and knit it through. So as a recap there, when you are knitting a right, you're making a right leaning increase. So M1R, you take your left needle and go into the back and knit from the front. When you're making a make 1 left, or M1L, you're taking your right needle. So right leaning, you take your left needle and go into the back. Left leaning, you take your right needle and go into the back. So that's an easy way to remember it. And then I'm just going to finish off this row. And finally what I'll do is I'll purl all the way across, and I'll come back and I'll give you a peek at how this sampler looks to give you a good indication of how all of the different increases look side by side. So now here we are. I finished purling all the way across the wrong side of the work, and let's take a look. So there are your increases doing yarn overs. That's quite open, quite lacy. Here you've got smaller eyelets, and that's done with the make one, where you're just going in on the bar between the stitches from front to back and pulling the yarn through. Now here are your increases knitting in the front and the back, and you can see the little purl bumps. Now, as I say, it's not super noticeable, but this technique is best used when you're working a pattern with knit and purl stitches so that the little purl bump disappears into the work. This section here, you can see the increases, and that was our left lifted increase, or LLI, and your right lifted increase, which is RLI. That's this section right here. And finally, my personal favorite, but it may not be yours after you've tried all these techniques. Each one is a little bit different, and it's whatever you find the easiest for you to do and the look that you prefer. I find this increase is perhaps a little more pronounced than the look of the left and the right leaning increases, but I do find it, for me, just a little tidier. And that is your make one right and your make one left. With the make one right, you're taking your left needle and going into the back of the bar and knitting from the front. And your make one left, you're taking your right needle, going into the back and knitting the stitch from the back. Now, because you've stayed this long and you've watched all the way through, you get a little bonus as well. So what I've done here is I've started my new knit row, but I'm just going to turn it so that I'm working on the purl side. And I'm going to show you how to make one left and make one right on your purl side or your wrong side. So here we go. I'm just going to slip my purl stitch over here. And what we do to make one right purl-wise is we take our left needle and we lift the bar from back to front, and then we purl the stitch just as you normally would in through the front of the stitch. So that is a make one right purl-wise. Now I'm just going to purl a stitch in between, because you should always have at least one stitch in between your increases. So we've done a make one right purl-wise. Now we are going to do a make one left purl-wise. And so with that, you take your left hand needle and you go from the front to the back. And to get that twist so you don't have a gap, in this case, you're going to knit into the back of the stitch. Now, if you've never done that before, what you're doing is you're coming in from the bottom up. Whoop, here we go. Try to get that camera ready. So up like that, and then purl it that way. So let's do one more purl stitch, and I'll do one more of those because that one is a little trickier. So what you're doing is you take your left needle You go from front to back. With the first one, you went back to front and you're purling into the back. This one, you're going front to back and you're going to purl from the back. So you're going in. Can you see that right here? Get in there, pick up that stitch like that, bring it to the front. Purl it as you normally would. Whoops, my yarn is splitting here. There we go. And that is how you do a make one right and a make one left on the purl side. So my favorite in terms of doing knitting increases are the make one left and make one right. And I've used that technique in my Smitten with Mittens pattern and a lot of other patterns as well. Now that just happens to be my favorite. It might not be yours. Give them all a try. It all depends on what you're doing and what technique you find works best for you. So have some fun exploring these techniques, and until next time, happy knitting.